Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura DiNardis, the Interim Dean of the School of Communication at American University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event about the award-winning documentary film For Sama. Today is actually the kickoff event for this year's Films Across Borders series. This is our year 6, I believe, working in partnership with embassies, cultural organizations, arts institutions, and environmental groups, showcasing films about the major issues of our time. The School of Communication aspires to serve the nation and the world as a teaching, learning, and research leader in our diverse fields of communication studies, film and media arts, journalism, and public communication. Events like this are a very important part of our mission. I'm delighted that the theme of this year's Films Across Borders series is resilience and hope. Now more than ever, we need stories to inspire and uplift us. Like so much this year, however, the entire series will be virtual. I encourage everyone to explore the films and events on our website, filmsacrossborders.org. And the good part about being virtual is that we can actually reach more people who can join us for this. I, of course, wish to thank our esteemed panel, which my colleague Nada Malouf will introduce. And I wish to thank our campus co-hosts for today's event, the School of International Service and the Washington College of Law Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Before I turn the program over to Nada, who organizes this series on behalf of American University, we would like to run the trailer for this incredible film. So I'll turn it over. Matt, would you run the trailer? Thank you so much, Matt. That's obviously the sizzle reel for the Films Across Borders event this year. And this looks incredible. Really, really great job on that. And we will show the trailer now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nada Malouf. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer for the School of Communication at American University. I'm very excited to welcome you this afternoon. Some of you may be morning from wherever you are, as we launch Films Across Borders, Stories of Resilience and Hope. When we came up with the theme earlier this January, we had no idea how important it would be to showcase stories that uplift and inspire us. And while this has been a particularly difficult year, this 2020, these challenges and hardships are not really unique to 2020. One such example is the focus of today's panel discussion about the documentary For Sama, an intimate exploration of the Syrian civil war ongoing since 2011. Syrian filmmaker Waad Al-Khatib shares her personal journey during this conflict as she falls in love, gets married, and gives birth to her daughter, Sama. For Sama is produced by Channel 4 News, ITN Productions for Channel 4, and WGBH Frontline. For Sama made its broadcast premiere on Frontline. As an aside, AU School of Communication has the unique distinction of being the only university to have a PBS frontline production unit located within our school. Our students have played a role in 15 co-productions. For Sama was released last year to critical acclaim and has received numerous awards, including the 2020 BAFTA for Best Documentary. Other programs in our Films Across Borders series this fall will explore issues of racial tension, environmental challenges with Inroads for Success, and the power of the arts. In addition to the campus sponsors Laura mentioned, I want to acknowledge our Films Across Borders partners from around the area who join forces each year to present Films Across Borders, and you can see the list on our screen. Let's take a quick look at the film trailer.
بحلب مدينتي لسه عم صور. هذا الشيء اللي عم بيخلي معنى لوجودي. ما حدا منا كان عنده أي فكرة كيف رح تتغير حياتنا للأبد.
حمزة أنا حامل. سما سما
سما عملت هالفيلم مشانك. بدي إياك تفهمي شو اللي كنا عم نقاتل مشانه.
أنا بحبك كثير أكثر من أصلا. في ضرب كثير اليوم.
سما أنا بعرف إنك عم تفهمي شو عم بصير. بقدر شوف هالشي بعيونك. ما عم تبكي مثل أي طفل عادي. هذا الشيء اللي عم يحرق لي قلبي. سما رح تسامحيني؟
Now I'm honored to introduce our moderator, AU Washington College of Law professor, Rebecca Hamilton. Rebecca's scholarship draws on her experience in the prosecution of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, as well as her work in conflict zones as a foreign correspondent. She is the author of Fighting for Darfur, Public Action and the Struggle to Stop Genocide, which analyzes citizen activism and the effort to stop mass atrocities. Rebecca.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you, Dean Donatis, and thank you to AU for the Films Across Borders series. In a moment when there seems to be such a strong instinct towards isolationism in the US and in other places, I think that we need films like For Sama. They're a lifeline for focusing our attention outside of ourselves. And I think the medium of film is able to speak to us in a way that print often isn't. Even the most well-researched books and articles on the war in Syria, this connects in a visceral way. And speaking as a mother, and I'm sure there are many of you out there in the audience who feel the same, I experience this film as simultaneously unimaginable and also fully relatable. And it is that combination that I think is the gift that WAD has given us with this film. So we are going to have about another 50 minutes together. And most of that time will be in discussion with our wonderful Syrian panelists joining us today, and I'm about to introduce them. But I will be sure to reserve time at the end for them to respond to your questions. So if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A function in Zoom as they come. And it's really helpful for us if you can add your institutional affiliation or your connection to the war in Syria, just to give us some context for the question. So let me begin by introducing Sana Mustafa. Sana is the Associate Director of Partnership and Engagement at Asylum Access, which many of you know works to challenge the legal barriers that keep refugees from moving safely, living safely, working, attending school. And prior to Asylum Access, Sana consulted with a number of international organizations on designing various engagement projects related to refugees and refugee inclusion. She is also a founding member of the Network for Refugee Voices, a refugee-led organization that works to increase refugee engagement with the international community. And she's on the board of Syria's first Syrian women's political movement. So we're delighted to have Sana joining us today. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Omar Al-Mughdad, who is a journalist, documentary filmmaker, himself a former Syrian refugee, and he writes a regular blog that you may have read at the Center for Migration Studies entitled Dispatches from the Global Crisis in Refugee Protection. Omar has published an extraordinary series of articles covering refugees' boat trips to Europe, and I'm sure you will have seen his work. It's been featured on the BBC, CNN, ABC, and a number of other international media outlets. So with an activist and a journalist on panel with us, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. To begin with, Omar, I'm hoping that you can help to situate us a little bit back in the period when the film is set, and just refresh us on what was happening with the war at that time. Omar, you're still unmuted.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you all for having me today. I hope I can introduce what's going on there back then. In fact, the whole Syria story is disastrous at all levels. I mean, the situation on the ground was atrocities committed by the Syrian regime, military campaign, indiscriminate barrel bombs attack on civilian populated areas, and in every corner in Syria. The Syrian regime also has engaged in a demonization campaign of the cities and towns that he is bombing with his supporters, the Russian. I remember just to go to how the situation looked like on the ground, there was a report that I conducted a series of interviews with the guy who has a farm, an olive farm in Hama suburb, where he has to shelter in this farm tens of refugees who fled from towns nearby. And this farm was bombed by the Russian. And the Russian next morning announced to the outside world that they were actually bombing an ISIS headquarters. And it turns out to be a farm that hosted tens of refugees. This kind of propaganda that you have to deal with over the last 7 years, and it was repeated all over again and again and again, especially with targeting mainly hospitals, schools, and civilian populated areas. The horrific or the heroic efforts that's being done by activists on the ground and citizen journalists to tell the outside world the reality and what's really going on there. That was also noted in the Syrian issue. Many of these journalists and activists paid their lives as a prize for this struggle. And I think what Sama and what Wad al-Khatib has done in her movie was trying to translate the reality on the ground to inform the outside world about what's going on in eastern Aleppo. Let's talk about Aleppo a little bit. Aleppo is a key strategic city in northern Syria and is a center industrial for the Syrian regime and the entire Middle East, in fact. This was really important for the Syrian regime. That's why it was under indiscriminate barrel bombs attack over the last, between 2012 and 2016. And they were targeting everything that moves on the ground. Hospitals, schools, as I mentioned before, none were excluded from the military campaign that led by the Syrian regime and the Russian for that matter. So even the White Helmets, civil organization, its primary job was to rescue people from the rebels. They were described as Al-Qaeda. And I remember Bashar al-Jafari, the Syrian representative to the United Nations, once said that they were the beautiful face of Al-Qaeda. I don't know what that means, as if Al-Qaeda needed to sugarcoat its image in front of the international community. So this kind of deceiving campaign and a continuous series of lies led by the Syrian regime on the international community scales, trying to mislead the audience by linking every area, every place, every location to Al-Qaeda and terrorism to justify this military campaign. I mean, it's quite widespread back then by between 2012 until 2016. I also came across, I remember in 2012, early 2012, when went into northern Syria with CNN team. And back then, the Syrian regime has launched a military campaign toward a small town called Teftanaz, northern Syria. And I came across interviewing a lot of people who fled that area. And I interviewed a woman, an old lady whose home was bombed and burned to the ground by the Syrian regime forces. And hearing these stories, it's really left you with no hope, in fact, because that lady, for example, when I remember her story, she was left alone with nothing behind on the Syrian international border, the Syrian-Turkish border. And I remember her telling me that she doesn't know what she's gonna do. I mean, she's alone on the international border. Everything was destroyed by the Syrian regime. She's not terrorist. There was no terrorist in her town. But it was the case, and their story stands for so many people. So these kind of stories, actually, you keep here every day, the daily basis over the last 7 years. The demonization campaign that the Syrian regime led to paint everyone with a singular brush in Syria and say, no, all of them are terrorists, that I'm fighting terrorism there. That was really disturbing. And of course, he was using the propaganda machines like RT, the Russia Today, and the Iranian media and Russian media in general. They were just propagating with the Syrian regime sword and saying that this is what's going on the ground, when the reality on the ground is completely different. The Eastern Aleppo was disastrous in all levels, and the people there has to live alone for a long time, under siege and under indiscriminate attacks by the Syrian regime and his supporters. So the situation was really disastrous, and none of these stories was actually, many of these stories wasn't actually out yet. So if we dig deep to the media reports back then, you see there's a gap between what's really going on the ground and what's the reality was, what the reality that people, they have to endure and to live every day in the daily basis.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think one of the reflections on this film is the work that it is doing as a counter narrative to the propaganda that the regime has been putting out. And you see the real human cost of producing that counter narrative, just the extraordinary lengths that Wad and her family went to. The other thing about the film is, and Wad says this herself, she's a filmmaker But she's also first and foremost an activist, and one drives the other. And Sana, I wanted to bring you in from the perspective of an activist. This film is telling Wad's personal story, but it is also, I think, the story of so many Syrian activists over the course of this long war, with different mechanisms for trying to rally attention to this crisis. What in the film resonated for you, given your experiences?
Yes, in fact, that the importance of this piece, that it's a series of diaries that the Wide has put out, documenting her daily life, that the hospital targeting, for example, because the Syrian regime long denied that he is targeting hospitals and field hospitals there, the destruction of the cities, the targeting of schools, for example. The Syrian regime has long denied this. And then there is a lady with her camera documenting at the moment live what's going on there, and challenging the Syrian regime narrative that he never targeted hospitals. Why should he? When you hear Bashar Assad and with his sluggish balderdash language that he gave he gave in every interview that he made, denying that he never targeted civilians, when you have these clear images in the movie show to the international community, the public opinion, that this is not the case. No, they were trying to make the life in Aleppo unlivable, because leading a normal life for the Syrian regime is something unacceptable and challenging. And this is not the image that he wants to show the international community or the public opinion. No, he wants to link these areas to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, so to legitimize the military campaign and what he's doing. There's no such a thing as moderate opposition, for example. So this is the importance of this kind of work that Waad al-Khatib has done there, which she has done an extensive filming, documenting every second of her daily life, every moment. Back then, when she was in Eastern Aleppo, show the reality on the ground, speaking to people, ordinary people, just in the neighborhood. That shows, no, this is not the story. This is what's really going on the ground. And I think that she has
that reality check.
There.
And Sana, I want to bring you in terms of what resonates for you in the film as an activist.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for having us and for showing this important film, and for American University for bringing us together. Everything Waad has filmed and everything the films show resonates with me. Parts of it resonates because it are things that I have lived personally in Syria alongside my family and other Syrian activists. And most importantly, it resonates with me very much as a refugee in the US now, because it finally gives context and tells the true story of what's happening in Syria. And I just want to say that, as we're talking about the counter narrative and what the regime narrative about the situation in Syria, just want to mention that the Western media narrative is not much better. And unfortunately, it misses the part of the revolution in Syria, the people's revolution in Syria, the first two and a half years. And that's what the film shows. The film shows exactly that it is people against regimes. And here we're talking not only about the Syrian regime, we're talking about the Russian regime, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about international community and other actors. And so the film does resonate in the sense of finally bringing back the truth to the conflict and making it a political one, because it has always been one. Actually, Waad and I grew up together. And we grew up to parents who, have raised us on so many values and principles and the importance of freedom and democracy. And of course, growing up in Syria under the Assad dictatorship was very difficult, and there were a lot of indoctrinations. But in our private spaces, in her family and in my family, there was always a lot of conversations that brought us to the moment of 2011 March, when the Syrian Revolution started. And I wanted to start here because I wanted to take a step back to talk about what we're talking about here. We're talking about a revolution that started by the people in 2011, revolting against a 40 years old dictatorship of a family that's ruling the majority of Syria, with detention, with favorism, with torture, with so many rules. And so when the Arab Spring started and eventually started in Syria, it was just very natural for Waad and for myself to just revolt. And she was in Aleppo going to school, and I was with my sister going to school in Damascus. And so we actually each one started planning and organizing protests and demonstrations in our cities and the cities we're living in. And then I remember very much us being in touch during the first few years when you were still as activists. There was a huge, beautiful community of Syrians that have come together. And that's, again, the missing piece in the narrative in the West about Syrians, despite and regardless of all ethnic and religious and race and all different barriers and backgrounds, we've all come together and we protested non-violently, peacefully, the Assad regime that faced us from day number one, March 15th, 2011, with weapons. And so the regime definitely did not leave a chance for us for peaceful protest. And despite this, we continued. And that continued up until 2012, mid-2012, and even a bit later. And we see even in this year in Sweden and other places, there are protests that take place. And I want to bring this piece because Waad talks about the people's struggle. Waad talks about the revolution in this film. And so that for me, that resonates a lot. And, and unfortunately, in my case, my father was detained in 2013. And as a result of this, my sisters and my family and I had to leave Syria. And Waad was in Aleppo, and Aleppo went under siege, and she stayed in Aleppo for the next 5 years. And Waad lived up to the values and principles that her parents raised her for and what the revolution started for, which is believing in the people, believing in freedom, and believing in our right. And she, resisted all of this with her camera. And as a woman and as an activist first and foremost, and as a journalist, that it became just part of who she is. And she started telling a story that's missing in the media. And after Waad left, she left with 500 hours of film, of footage. And what we see, it's part of it. And there's so much more that what's important about it is that going to be used to hold all parties accountable for their war crimes in Syria. And the other aspect that resonates with me, that the film highlights what the Assad regime and the Russian regime had done in Aleppo in bombing hospitals, which is and targeting civilians. It is not a civil war. And I think that's the thing that I want to highlight here. In the West narrative, we always talk about Syria as a civil war, and that takes away everything that's happening in Syria. The conflict in Syria is a multi-layered conflict. It started with a people's revolution, similarly to the protests we see in the US with Black Lives Matter. It is people protesting atrocities. It is people protesting systematic abuse. And that's how it started. And yes, it did take in some years, or a year between 2012 and 2013, a form of civil war, which some Syrians were fighting against each other. But starting in 2013 up until this moment, it has been a world war, a proxy war. Russians are not Syrians. Americans have been boots on the ground in Syria since 2013, are not Syrians. Iranians are not, and Hezbollah militias are not, and so many other parties are not. And terminology matters, and the narrative matters, and the film brings us back to the original narrative. And for us as Syrians, and for Waad and myself, and I know this, what's important for us and the way we feel we can resist from exile is by countering the narrative and by re-owning the narrative that we started and we shaped.
Thank you. And that notion of reclaiming the narrative and being able to see the reality that you have lived reflected on screen is just an extraordinary contribution. And I just agree so wholeheartedly that language matters. And we see this, unfortunately, Syria is not the first place where the terminology of quote unquote civil war is used to whitewash atrocities that are happening, to make it seem like there is something that is sort of neutral, this side versus the other side, and really diminishes our understanding of the reality. Omar, I want to come back to you, and speaking of the challenge of this story in the Western media, you are, a Syrian, an American. You have lived the situation on the ground, but you've also been writing for Western media outlets. What have you found to be useful strategies, techniques, ways of conveying the sort of lived reality in Syria out to an audience that is just not contextualized historically, culturally, in the context. You're on mute.
I always forget to unmute myself. Yeah, in fact, there is a quite important thing. A lot of brave journalists who paid their lives, Western journalists, Syrian activists, who paid their lives in Syria, trying to tell the world what's going on. Stephen Sotloff, Austin Tice, James Foley, the CNN team, they have an extensive report about what's going on. Many Western media knows what's going on. And it's been reported extensively in the Western media. And I myself have done a series of reports between 2012 until today, and for the Western media telling what's going on there. So the media was really open in the United States and Europe in general to tell the world about what's going on and about Assad regime. And many brave journalists paid their lives, was kidnapped by ISIS and elsewhere. It's true that it's not a civil war in a way, but for the Syrian regime, he was trying to play on the sectarianism in Syria, play on the ethnic division in the country by dividing the country and break it apart and say, hey, look, there's a bunch of radical Islamist Sunni militias who wants to kill anyone who's different, as I mentioned before. And that's not really true on the ground. It's true in such a way because they have turned the whole situation on the ground into an international proxy war, and each one start having a proxy. Let me just take you back to the reports that's conducted by the IDA intelligence agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency. They have a report, and they said in that report, quote unquote, there is a possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared an Islamic principality in eastern Syria, and that's what the powers who oppose the Syrian regime wants in order to isolate the Syrian regime. That report was conducted in 2012, before ISIS Al-Qaeda came to existence. So we have knowledge about these groups. So the international community has played a huge part of letting these radicals flew to Syria. We're talking about 40,000 foreign fighters. They were in Syria between 2013 until today. These were not Syrians, and the Syrian people, they were the ones who sinned against rather than the sinners. They were the one who blamed. Let's block Syrian refugees, turning the United States, for example, as a hostile environment for refugees. Keep refugees out. We don't want these people. When they were the people who were running literally from the Syrian regime terrorism, which was what no one talk about today. We're just talking about ISIS terrorism and Al-Qaeda terrorism. And it seems that terrorism is acceptable if it comes from a guy with a beard, but it's not acceptable if it's not come from the guy with a beard, but if it is acceptable if it came from a guy with a suit and a tie, like the Syrian regime, because the damage that Bashar Assad and his supporters has done to Syria is enormous and is indescribable. This guy has engaged in an arbitrary detention for a lot of civil activists in 2011 and 18 March, when everything started in Daraa and south in my hometown. They were shooting at unarmed people at peaceful demonstration in the street. These stories is there, and it's been reported, but the problem here, the international community helped turning Syria to where it is right now by just taking it easy on the Syrian regime and trying to turn the whole Syria story into their best interest, like supporting militias left and right, and then fighting over Syria, and the Syrian people were taken as refugees as a collective result for this issue. So it's incredibly important to understand that there was a lot of journalists who were trying to tell what's going on. Many activists, Syrian journalists, Syrian activists were trying so hard, but the situation in Syria was so hostile. So toward them, they were systematically targeted. So many of them decided to leave the country and to find themselves taken as refugees. all over the world. My case, for example, but the whole matter is really disastrous when it comes to the international powers like the United States, Russian, Iranian, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. All these countries has played a very negative role in Syria. For the United States now, it is not the talk. It's not about Assad regime. All we have is just a bunch of economic sanctions that harm the people more than harm the Syrian regime. We know that economic sanctions never worked. But at the same time, when you ask any politician in the United States, and I met many of them, they say, okay, our primary now attention is to fight terrorism, not to fight Assad regime terrorism, because we are not affected by Assad regime terrorism, but these are the guys who would come after us if we let them. So this is a moral question. A lot of questions has to be laid down here, describing what's going on in Syria, but I don't see it in a short term or in a long term with this regime, as they trying to recycle the guy in Damascus and sell it back to the people and saying, well, this is what we have. There's no alternative, and you have to stuck with this guy with all the records that he has, the crimes that he committed, and the things that he done in Syria, not just in Syria, actually, in the neighboring countries. Millions of Syrian refugees now in neighboring countries sitting down. They have no hope for returning while this person in power. And I don't know how this is gonna be resolved, but I don't see it in the short run or in the long run about knocking down this fascist style regime who still thrive in Damascus.
You're starting to get at some of the issues that I hope we can get into, but what is very clear is at this point, with the work of so many, often Syrian journalists, also journalists from other places coming in, really doing their best to get their heads around what is going on. There is documentation of the sheer extent of the human suffering, and we have had this available to us for years and years and years. And in previous atrocities, you know, when this sort of history book is written, you get these quotes from US officials, from other government officials, from UN officials saying, we didn't know, or we didn't really understand the full extent of the suffering. Sana, turning to you, we cannot say that with Syria. And so what is your best explanation? How do you make sense of the fact that in the face of this overwhelming and well-documented human suffering, the situation continues?
It's hard to make sense of it. And I honestly think the system failed us as Syrians, as refugees, as women, as people of color. On all levels, the systems have been failing us because the systems are designed by people that want to fail, you know, people in the global south, and want to fail the Syria conflict. And so I don't think the system makes sense, and I don't think the response towards Syria makes sense. And if you, I guess the question here would be, why the conflict has been ongoing for 9 years, why a regime could use chemical weapons to kill its own people, and that could be documenting and could be going live on camera on Facebook, and everyone across the world is seeing it, and it's still happening. And so why I feel like sometimes I personally be like, this, it cannot be true, but the reality is true, and this is the world we live in. And I think, like, if we want to talk more politically, from the US side, the Obama administration failed us on Syria, and we are where we are because of the lack of action, or because of the action of the red line that led us to where we are. And the international community is not much better. The UN is not much better. The United Nations is inherently designed to actually enforce its own power. The structure of the UN with the 5 countries in veto power, where Russia is there, means we would never take action on Syria. If Russia committing war crimes in Syria, why would a resolution pass how could a resolution pass by the UN to even prevent these atrocities in Syria? So the system is just reinforcing itself, unfortunately. And everyone is claiming to be from the European Union to the United Nations to the United States. Everyone is claiming to and condemning what's happening in Syria, but there is no serious will to address what's happening happening in Syria. And I think that's the bottom line for us. When there was a serious war, when there was interest, this happened in Iraq and Libya and other places. But if every country is interested with their own agendas and deals with, the Iran and the US deal, and then Russia and its role in other conflict, and then again back to the United Nations and its own structure. And so I think the system just failed us, and I have zero hope in the system to address what's happening in Syria. But I do have hope in the people of Syria. We are not giving up on taking everyone accountable to their war crimes. Syrian activists in Europe have been working and coordinating with the criminal courts in Germany and now in the Netherlands to take war criminals accountable to their war crimes. And we are every day demanding to know the fate and to know about the lives of over 130 forcibly disappeared and missing persons in Syria on the hand of the Assad regime and other parties. And we are doing all we can to counter the narrative, to keep talking about Syria, in addition to the work that we're doing to support and help Syrian refugees. So we are not leaving the conflict, and this is what gives me hope. And we are even fighting to be in the political conversations about Syria, which it's very ridiculous that even the solution is not designed by Syrians. And the Geneva talks, I mean, they would include like a Syrian now, like just as a box checking. And this is problematic in itself. But again, the hope is that we are not giving up, but the system gives me zero hope, to be honest.
This is so sort of resonant with, I've spent a lot of time on atrocities that happened in Darfur, and at times there was huge engagement from the international community, but at the end of the day, other priorities come in place, and it's really Sudanese found that they only had themselves to actually rely on. And that recognition is an important one to own, I guess, that no matter the words and condemnations that are made, at the end of the day, it is the Syrian people who are going to stay committed to this. And so I think for the rest of the international community, the question has got to be, well, how do we stand in solidarity with and amplify the work that the Syrian people are doing themselves, given that they know the situation best. I just want to invite the audience to ask questions through the Q&A function that you have on Zoom. And if you want to direct them to either of the panelists in particular, or post them generally, but that function is open. And so we would love to get your questions coming in. I was wondering, either of you, if as we open this up to Q&A, what are you looking for in the next sort of 6 to 12 month period that will give you an indication of either progress or deterioration for the situation for Syrian civilians on the ground?
This question is for me. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Sorry.
Yes, Omar, let's start with you.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry. Well, in fact, the whole issue, as I mentioned earlier, the Russians were trying to recycle the Syrian regime, but they are now facing resistance from a lot of Syrian people. They know that this guy. I think they start getting the idea that this guy is. It's not. They are not be able. They will not be able to recycling him and sell him back to the international community with all the efforts that they are doing here. So with the opposition stands firm to not accepting this regime, I think that must be an international efforts led by the Western power, the United States, to exert some pressure and make a change. As I said before, I don't see it in the short run, but I'm looking down the road. This may happen because now what we are seeing that the Syrian opposition, they still, with all the difficulties that they have, they still determined that this regime is unacceptable to be in power the way that he is. But a deal must be put on the table at some point, I think, by the Russian, to end this situation. We still talking about millions of refugees in refugee camps. These people, some of these people, be living there for the last 7 years. So you're talking about 7 or 8 years period. This is a long time. An entire generation now emerged from the refugee camps. In the refugee camps, this is a problem that start emerging, and I think some of the governments start noticing that this problem has to be solved, but it can't be solved with Bashar Assad in power in Damascus. Talking like I'm talking politics here, but still, as Sana mentioned before, we have faith in the Syrian people. Millions, the Syrian regime now in direct confrontation with millions, with half of the Syrian nation, at least those who fled the country, who once gets back until the Bashar Assad leaves the power. And that's maybe something we can count on later on to define or to exert some serious pressure on the Syrian regime and his supporters, the Russian, and to send the message that this is not going to happen. So no matter what you do, this guy at the end of the day has to leave.
So we've got some great questions in from the audience. I wanted to start working our way through those. Sana, maybe the first question from Greg Aikens. What is the best way for us non-Syrians to get involved?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, we can't do this alone. So thank you for the question, definitely. And allies are very important. You can do a lot. I mean, first and foremost, you can ensure the centering of Syrian voices and Syrian expertise at the heart of the solutions and the policies around Syria. Let's make sure the narrative is talked about by Syrians. Let's make sure that the solutions and the discussions and the negotiations around Syrians include Syrians, are shaped by Syrians. Let's make sure that that Syrians are part of the conversations here on panels. So there's a lot of you could do to centering Syrian voices. And also there's a lot you could do in your country here. And fortunately, who rules the United States of America affects my country, affects my well-being, and affects so many people's well-being overseas. And so exercising here, people exercising their citizenship right, exercising your right to vote, which is a huge privilege. As a 29 years old, I've never ever voted in my entire life. And people live and die and never vote back home. So who you vote for, it matters. And then taking them accountable and pushing them to act on Syria is very important. I don't have much, to be honest. Better hope that the Biden administration, hopefully if it happens, will act differently on Syria, to be honest. But if you care and I care, and if we push for it, they could act differently on Syria. So this allyship is very important. And I would ask you to always ask Syrians and to engage with Syrians, to ask them what you could do, what could people do, because asking is way better than making assumptions.
Thank you. Another question from Maria. Omar, let's ask you to field this one. What groups or people should we be following to get accurate information on the situation, and any US lawmakers who are supporting the cause?
Well, in fact, there is no specific media outlet. I mean, it's hard to tell you that to follow this or to follow that. But the most of the reports that's been done in the US media specifically, it's from a professional point of view. It's good, but it's not enough. I mean, sometimes it could be misleading because they're not telling you the whole story. They are focusing on a tiny corner of the issue. So what you need to make up your mind by following a variety of information. There is the United Nations has a lot of reports regarding this issues. They have yearly reports. There are many you can follow regarding the human crisis in Syria. The Syrian regime discriminate barrel bombs attacks, for example, the detainees that the Syrian regime is sitting in Syrian regime jails in violation of international law. These were very well documented reports done by professionals in the United Nations and its organization, the Amnesty International, where you can get all the information that you need about what happened and how the Syrian regime dealt with who's against whom, and you can you can tell that, and the media, you can also make up your mind and follow the international media and make your own judgments on that. The U.S. lawmakers, supporters, and back to the Obama administration points, I think at least Obama has sort of some support to the Syrian opposition. He didn't take a strong position on Bashar Assad, but with President Donald Trump, things are totally different right now, because he hands the whole issue to the Russian once and for all, and he say, all I care about is just the oil, and I want to keep some troops there to protect the oil. And even he was about to give up on the Kurdish forces, those who fought with him on all fronts to destroy ISIS. But unfortunately, I don't see it with this administration. But I think there are some voices in the Congress who still supporting the Syrian cause and the Syrian issues, and many of them has put out statements, clear statements about the Syrian regime and Bashar Assad and about his atrocities.
And let me just say on that, whenever, for all of us that are US based or wherever you are, whenever your local representative does say something helpful on the Syrian crisis, then call them, call their office, let them know that is appreciated and valued by the people that they're representing, because they need to hear that. We have a next question specifically for you, Sana. How do you deal with separating personal and professional? Do you separate personal and professional, I guess I would say, when the conflict is so personal and family, friends like Wada are so implicated in what's happening? What does taking a break for you look like? How do you not burn out?
I mean, thanks for the question. I feel very rarely we get asked about ourselves and how we're doing. So, I mean, in this case, personal is not separate from professional. For me personally, what I work on is refugee rights. As a refugee itself, myself, and as my family being refugees, it's very personal as well. And what brings me to this profession is my personal and my lived experience, which adds a lot to the way I do my work. And also my work on Syria comes from a very personal place. And so actually, I'm very glad that all my work comes from lived experience. So I feel very entitled and I feel comfortable and I feel I own it to talk about it and work on it. However, at the same time, that poses definitely big pressure on us. I mean, we left Syria. I mean, we all, and especially you can see from Wa'ad, you can only imagine the amount of trauma that has been experienced. And all of us, after leaving Syria, there's nothing like PTSD. It's not post-trauma. It's actually ongoing trauma. And the conflict in Syria is still going. And my father is still missing for over 7 years, and we know nothing about him. And Wa'ad still lost so many friends in Aleppo and left a home behind, and so many atrocities. And so we leave, and everything this is still happening. So unfortunately, mental health is a very, very important piece, but it's a missing piece, and it's something that we ourselves unfortunately don't always address, because we're always drained by the conflict and wanting to do something about it. And then as refugees, it's not like you enjoy access to healthcare and therapists, and that's a privilege. But at the same time, you know, those exact things keep us going. And what keeps me going is the amazing support system that I got, for example, here, the amazing social support system, the friendships, and the community in the US. And at the same time, I do personally try to take some time to unpack some of the things that happened and to process a bit. But it's a long-term project, and access to resources is limiting. So this is something we have to address when we talk about refugees and mental health.
Oh, thank you, Sana. It feels to me that there's Syrians are being asked just impossible things, to not only be the suffering that comes directly from the Assad regime and the total destruction of this beautiful country, but then to be carrying the weight of solving the situation. And it's not that others can step into that role. And it's not that you would even want them to, but at the same time, it's a huge cost to be living through it daily. Let me take one final audience question. I'm sorry we won't get to all of them, but from Tariq Nadim. What roles do you think Syrians who are living outside of Syria will play in the reconstruction of a post-war Syria, especially with fewer professionals and doctors living in Syria currently? Unmute yourself if you want to answer, Omar.
All right. Well, in fact, the Syrian in exile has done a lot of work lobbying in the United States and Europe, and they are now pushing back, informing also the locals in these areas about what's going on there. And they have done a lot of work. I think the Syrian community in Washington, D.C. is working so hard with lawmakers and with officials in the United States, trying to exert some pressure and to first explain what's going on in Syria really, and trying to provide an alternative for Bashar al-Assad regime. Because the idea or the notion that has been widespread in the media and all elsewhere, that Assad regime has no alternative. There's no alternative to this regime. And I mean, that's really offensive in a way, because Syria has a lot of highly educated people, people who can run countries like the United States. So it is not difficult to find an alternative for Syrian people. Just give it time and give it a chance to the people to determine their future. And I think many of the Syrian in exile has doing a lot of work. The activists who left Syria now, they are mobilizing the efforts on the ground. You can see it with all in local events and the places where they were being resettled. So the fights for them is still on. So it's never turned off.
Thank you. And one of the consequences of Syrians being forced to flee is that we do have very strong Syrian communities all across the globe. I have to spotlight, as a professor at the Washington College of Law, we have the Syrian Initiative to Combat Sexual and Gender-Based Violence, being Syrian-led, run right here in DC. And that's one of countless initiatives that are just in our local community. But the other thing, and I have to say this as we wrap up with the film, is share the film. For all of those that have joined us today that have watched the film, it speaks for itself in how powerful it is in doing the things that we've talked about, in centering Syrian voices, and in pushing back against the narrative that the regime has tried to put out. And so sharing the film, hosting virtual events to screen the film, and WAD has built an initiative called Action for Summer, which can connect the film to actions. Thank you, Matt, I think has just put it up in the chat function for us. So get onto the website for Action for Summer, see what you can do in your area. And there's no end to the creativity of people when we come together and really focus on what we can build together. Huge gratitude to AU for bringing us this film, obviously to Wad El-Khatib for the extraordinary life that she has lived through to document it as she was living through it so that we could all see that and experience it. And my huge gratitude to our wonderful panelists. Thank you for bringing your expertise here to the conversation today. I would love to spend many more hours talking to you, but I know we have limits of Zoom attention spans. So thank you everyone for today, and please, please share the film with anyone that you know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.